Department at the Faculty of Letters and Humanities of SFAC, dear guest speakers, dear participants from Tunisia and abroad, on behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to welcome you all to this first Tunisian International Systemic Functional Linguistics Conference and Workshop. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation. Thank you for coming and thank you for joining us. Now, the proverb says, actions speak louder than words. Okay. But I believe that words are also very important, and I think every linguist does so, because they just make of the study of words their job, okay, and they devote their whole lives to the study of words and language, okay, and trying to say right about it. And this is what we are all doing, okay, and what we spend our lives and our careers doing. Now, one or a group of these people are systemic functional linguists who try to kind of come up with a framework of a theory that is open, okay, that is applicable linguistics, as Christian says in his introduction to the 2014 edition, an applicable linguistics that has tried to be open to other, not only to other linguistic theories, but also to other disciplines of study. And this is what we'll be discussing these days. These applicability, okay, are these applications of systemic functional linguistics in to the other fields of study and to other contexts. Okay. Now, the idea of this conference was born 2 years ago out of monthly seminars, monthly SFL seminars within the research laboratory approaches to discourse at the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at the University of SFAC. Okay? And the idea was very warmly welcomed and supported by my colleague Lise Fontaine from the University of Cardiff. Okay? And I see this opportunity to thank Lise for her support and for accepting to co-organize this conference with us. Okay? And as it is time for thanks, I also would like to deeply thank Professor Munir Triki for his support, okay? The Director of the Research Laboratory Approaches to Discourse. Thanks are also due to Professor Mohammed Ben Ayed, the Dean of the Faculty of Letters of SFAC, to the President and the Vice President of the University of SFAC, who fortunately apologized for not being here today because they have the University Council. Thanks are also due to some of our sponsors and supporters, Professor Abdelbi Ben Baya and Professor Taha Labesi from the University of Tunis for their financial support, Professor Ali Bakhlouti, Director of the Research Laboratory in Harmonic Analysis at the University of SFAC for logistic and especially moral support and support in terms of expertise. Now, thanks are also due to our private sponsors, British Council and Schooling Plus Center of Languages. Okay. Last but not least, I must say that this conference couldn't have seen light if it were not for the wonderful team with whom we've been working together, with a team, very nice teamwork, a lot of enthusiasm and much effort. Okay, so I would like, on your behalf, to thank the organizing committee and thank you very much for your teamwork and for your enthusiasm to this, towards the fulfillment and towards the achievement of this conference. Now, before I give the floor to my colleague, I would just want to tell you about another baby born of the monthly seminars. That is the Tunisian Association of Systemic Functional Linguistics, CFLAT, okay, founded in June 2014, with the major goal of promoting research in SFL in Tunisia and creating networks with other associations in SFL all over the world. Okay, we started with the European Association and we hope to establish links and networks with other associations. Now, you are all invited to join our association, and membership cards will be handed by Amani. Now, I think part of these I should give some practical information. So this will be the main conference room for the plenaries and for the workshop. The parallel sessions will be in the two conference rooms. room 2 and room 3. The coffee breaks are in the Magnolia Bar, just on the left of the registration desk. And of course, if you need any piece of information or if you have any request, you can just ask one of the organizing committee members wearing the red badges. Okay, now those wearing the red badges are members of the organizing committee, so you can go to them for any piece of information or any request. Now, we have two social activities, okay, one will be this evening. We'll be celebrating Michael Halliday's 90th birthday, because you know Halliday is one of the people who spent their lives doing language and linguistics. Okay? And today, or this evening, we'll be celebrating his 90th birthday in this room at 9 o'clock. You are all cordially invited. Now, our second social activity will be the excursion on Saturday afternoon to Carthage and Sidi Bou Said. Now, if you'd like to join the excursion, please just sign in your name at the registration desk so that we need to organize it. Now, could you please do that before Friday midday, okay? Because we need to organize the coach. Now, I hope you will enjoy the conference, and for our colleagues coming from abroad, I hope you will enjoy your stay in Tunisia. You are welcome, and I hope also that this event will be the first, okay, in successive other events. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you again. And I will give the floor to my colleague Lise Fontaine, the chair of the European Association of Systemic Functional Linguistics. Thank you.
Thank you, Kina. It's really a pleasure to be here and to have had a small supporting role in what has been a lot of hard work, mostly by Akila, and of course her fantastic team and colleagues. I had the pleasure of being here in the department last year at SFAX, and I was witness to the very exciting moment of the association's, I don't know what we call it, the sending off of all of the documents, which I documented with photographs and proof. And it was really an exciting time, and I think I attended one of your meetings in preparation for the conference, and there really was a lot of enthusiasm, and I see that the hard work does not show on everybody's faces, because you're all still smiling and happy and still as enthusiastic as you were then. In a way, I guess I'm here as the chair. The European Association has extended its support to the association, to the conference. We're not only neighbors, but share a lot of common interests and objectives and goals. I'll just go a little bit further very briefly in history, back to 2010, when Akila and I first met. She came to Cardiff to our first summer school, and we started talking then about ways in which we could collaborate more and interact more between our departments. I think that continued later with Tom and Jared at the next European conference, and at every other opportunity we have had, we've tried to find ways to bridge our departments as we share so many common interests. So it is really a pleasure to be here to see this as one link in the chain of many more to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, dear guest speakers and attendees from Britain, France, Hong Kong, Spain, and other parts of the world. Dear colleagues and participants from Tunisia, dear head of the English department in SFAX, dear researchers affiliated to our laboratory on approaches to discourse or other research organs, it gives me special pleasure to extend the warmest terms of welcome to you among us here at Hammamet in Tunisia. Your presence here and now is a brave act of support for what is best in Tunisia, its human resources, its time-honored civilization and history, its contribution to culture and knowledge. I feel honored by the fact that His Excellency, the Minister of Higher Education, has agreed to place this event under his high patronage. I'm also grateful to the Rector of the University of Sfax and the Dean of the Faculty of Letters and Humanities in Sfax for their unconditional support. I'm particularly indebted to Professor Akhila Salami Baghlouti and all her team, all the organizing committee, for their most commendable and successful organization of this international conference. Our laboratory opens up avenues for research on the broadest spectrum of discourse studies. It includes research axes such as pragmatics, critical discourse analysis, semiotics, cultural studies, forensic linguistics, theoretical and applied linguistics, translation studies, and media studies. Its members belong to different departments such as the Arabic, French, English, German, and Russian departments in Tunisia. It has close cooperation with other related laboratories throughout the world in matters of split PhDs, joint international conferences, joint publications, and training programs. This conference is organized by the laboratory in partnership with the Systemic Functional Linguistics Association of Tunisia and Cardiff University and the European Association of SFL. All the organizing committee for their most commendable and successful organization of this international conference. Our laboratory opens up avenues for research on the broadest spectrum of discourse studies. It includes research axes such as pragmatics, critical discourse analysis, semiotics, cultural studies, forensic linguistics, theoretical and applied linguistics, translation studies, and media studies. Its members belong to different departments such as the Arabic, French, English, German, and Russian departments in Tunisia. It has close cooperation with other related laboratories throughout the world in matters of split PhDs, joint international conferences, joint publications, and training programs. This conference is organized by the laboratory in partnership with the Systemic Functional Linguistics Association of Tunisia and Cardiff University and the European Association of SFL. I must congratulate everybody on the felicitous choice of the theme of this conference. Indeed, SFL is undeniably one of the most influential grammars in the world, and we are blessed with the presence of some of its most influential scholars. This is by and large an excellent opportunity for our researchers to deepen their knowledge of this framework and for our laboratory to show some of its potential. I wish you a very successful conference and a very pleasant and peaceful stay in Tunisia. God bless you.
Thank you. First, I have an announcement because I have an earache. And so I asked kindly this morning my friend and colleague Ali Baghlouti to sit close to me and force my lobe a little bit down. So I avoid the echoes of the Malabar caves in Ian Foster's A Passage to India, because the echo disturbs me. The second point is that I was an MA student at the Faculty of Letters in Manduba. There was that Canadian teacher teaching us. And he told us at the time that when you have a presentation, in order to avoid the shivering in front of the audience, you put your hands in your pockets, which is again a problem for me because I don't know who's going to hold the mic for me this morning. But I'm sure that I'm going to overcome this difficulty this morning. We hope so. All right. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you and to make part of this opening ceremony to the SFL, Applications and Implications, jointly organized by the Systemic Functional Linguistics Association of Tunisia and the University of Sfax. And I'd like to express my sincere thanks to the organizers of the conference, in particular Professor Aqil Bakhlut and her team, and to our honorable speakers. Aqila Bakhluti has given us this opportunity to attend this learned and prestigious conference, attended by leading scholars coming from different parts of the world. A conference, I believe, that is going to participate in the blurring of the boundaries between North and South, East and West, is giving us an opportunity to exchange ideas and information, knowledge and scholarship. And the common denominator is language. And I do believe that language, even though it's a common denominator, it also holds the various specificities of every cultural context. And being diasporic and global does not negate the importance of the local, because I do believe that the local is going to make us appreciate and improve our understanding of the global. And this conference is but an example, or chance. This is going to allow us to experience this opportunity. This is now an opportune time to declare the official opening of the conference, and I wish you all 3 fruitful days of academic debate, and that you will have a pleasant stay in Hammamet. I warmly welcome you again, and have a nice day in Israel. Thank you.
I'd like to move to our first speaker, Professor Jock Thompson from the University of Liverpool in the United Kingdom. David, would you like to chair this session, please?
That his academic life started in a small British institution which unfortunately simply has the wrong shade of blue. This institution is in a small English town called Oxford. But from then on, nothing has looked back. And if I were to pick out perhaps a few highlights just to introduce them, things you already know. Jeff was chair of the International SFL Association, before that of the European SFL Association. He's co-editor of Functions of Language, and so on. I mean, all these things are just highlights in a vast mass of material. And if I were to pick out a couple of things from his vast list of publications, perhaps one, when my students were having difficulty getting through IFG, I always pointed them in the direction of Jeff's introduction, a model of clarity, which was a great help to vast numbers of students in SFL. And if one had to pick out another book, perhaps the one he co-edited with Susan Hunston on evaluation in language, which I think has become a classic in this domain. Right, I think I have to stop to let Jeff get on, because that's what you want to hear, and he's going to tell us about grammatical metaphor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, David. I'm delighted and very honoured to be invited. It's my first visit to Tunisia. I've been to the Maghreb, I've been to Algeria many years ago, but not to Tunisia. I didn't quite make it then. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to, and honoured to be opening, as it were, the first meeting of CISFLA, and I wish the association all the best in the future. I should apologise for appearing somewhat less formally dressed than I would normally be. That's thanks to an airline that I will not mention that managed to lose my luggage on the way here. However, I did at least have a clean shirt. So. Right, what I want to talk about today is, in a sense, stepping back a little from the specific topic of the conference to think about issues that I find raise interesting but also difficult points whenever one is trying to go about doing SFL-inspired analysis, and then that will lead on to applications. So I'm going to be looking at interpersonal grammatical metaphor and arguing for the need for double vision and thinking about what that implies. It's going to be a slightly depressing talk because I'm going to end up by talking about problems. However, a lot of what I'm going to talk about draws quite heavily on Halliday, what's it now called? Halliday's Introduction to Functional Grammar by Christian Matheson. So we've got two names in there. And I won't always indicate the debt. But starting with another publication by Michael Halliday, he's got a very interesting volume on complementarities in language, and he talks about three kinds of complementarity: lexis and grammar, different resources for construal of meaning, language as system, language as text, the issue instantiation, two ways of looking at language, and speaking of and writing, doing two different things, not the same thing in two different ways. But these are complementarities which, as it were, give language and the flexibility to cope with the many demands that we put upon it in communicating. Here's what he actually says about complementarity. So complementarity means having things both ways. That you have your cake, you eat your cake and have it. Michael always insists on getting that old proverb the right way round. Normally we say you have your cake and eat it, which doesn't make sense. Complementarities provide the surplus energy, the flexibility that enables a language to flourish in its changing eco-social environment. He also says complementarity is what turns either or into both and. Light is either particle or wave, it can't be both. But it is. We have to choose what it is we want to know, what we want to measure, where a thing is, how fast it's going. Grammar has no place for either orism, it always turns either or into both and. The bit of that I want to pick up on is we have to choose what it is we want to know, what we want to measure. And what I want to do is to turn to another complementarity, which I might just roughly call text as wording, text as meaning. This comes up, I think, particularly because of the issue of grammatical metaphor, and I'll explain in a moment why I see that as a complementarity. That they're basically grammatical metaphor, an interplay between the wording and the meaning, such that new meanings are enabled with both sides of the complementarity contributing. Now, the lexis and grammar complementarity inevitably reminds me of Ruqayyah Hassan's famous title of the paper. In fact, talk about lexis as the most delicate grammar,
the grammarian's dream, she calls it. Now, for me, grammatical metaphor is, I think, possibly the grammarian's nightmare. When I have problems with analysing, very often it is because of metaphor. It's a wonderful resource. Language would not function without it. It's a fascinating resource, but it constantly causes problems for the analyst on how to handle it. The problem is we need grammatical metaphor involves seeing both particle and wave at the same time. They're both there. Language users have no problem with it. They simply understand the meaning that's produced by the interplay. They can unpack it in some cases, but basically it's not a problem. It's a problem for the analyst. The analyst, in order to understand what's going on in grammatical metaphor, I would argue, needs to be able to see the particle and the wave at the same time. Now, just very quickly, ideational metaphor has been very fully looked at. I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but just a little example to remind us. Here's one of my favourite examples from a medical textbook. I'm not going to try and read it, but we can, in order to understand that as a non-medical expert, the medical expert would simply read it and say, yeah, I know exactly what that means. As a non-medical expert, I actually had to unpack it. And you end up with something like, you get a very simple grammatical structure, but you unpack it. If the doctor investigates the problem, these are the kind of things I have to kind of add to myself. The bits in italics are my guesses as to what's meant, but I don't know on all cases. By culturing blood, by aspirating blood, I have no idea if you can say that. I think that's what's meant, but that's a non-medical, I don't know. And if she immobilises the patient's joint, notice we have to know that it's the joint that's immobilised and not the patient. And I had to ask a doctor which it was to work out what immobilisation meant. And if she administers the appropriate antibiotics promptly, this may occasionally solve the problem. So that's the kind of thing. Normally what happens is, as a learner, you go through stages of reading text like the second text, and you gradually get able to handle the first text. But, as I say, I think the meaning comes from the interplay that's going on. It's also just worth remembering, of course, that it's not just a bit of it, it's the whole grammar. So, for example, the lead to is in fact encoding, construing a conjunctive relationship between the parts of that, in fact, clause. So that, I'm not going to spend time on that, just a reminder of some of the issues that come up. I want to look at, if we think about it, because I'll need to come back to this point of the semantics of the lexicogrammar, we can see what's going on there as, whereas normally doings get realised by verbal forms and things get realised by nominal forms, in this case we get a doing realised by a nominal form, which then gives us a new meaning, which is we can call a doing thing, an event thing, in a term which I know Lise is going to be talking about in China later. But there's a new meaning created by this transition across the boundary between semantics and lexicogrammar. Now, if we look at interpersonal metaphor with that boundary in mind, here's a typical example of one kind of metaphor of mood. Okay. Okay, right. Sorry, they are on the handouts. Sorry, yes. And that's the least important one, so yes, I will do. Sorry, reading it. Yes. So, interpersonal metaphor, I wouldn't do it that way if I were you. and another. I think it isn't uploaded yet, is it? Notice just a small point there, the is it, the tag question in English, which doesn't normally pick up on, I think it isn't uploaded yet, do I? So there's immediately a sign of something going on. Now, my term for these two types, which I'll explain as I come on. The first type I would see is enacting interpersonal metaphor, and the second as representing. Representing, of course, coming from representation, the ideational. Now, the distinction isn't watertight, as we'll see, but if I find it a useful one. If we go back to the first one. That's it. I wouldn't do it that way if I were you. This is, in terms of speech functional terms, we have a command. By enacting, I mean the whole utterance enacts a command. You can't point to a bit of it and say, that is the meaning of command. It's the whole utterance which is doing a command function. But it's doing it in the form of a declarative. A declarative which is as if giving information about yourself, about the speaker's self. Now, one way of looking at this is offered by Miriam Taverniers in her PhD and subsequent writings. She talks about the semantic stratum and the lexicogrammatical stratum. Above we have the speech functions, what's going on. This is based very heavily, of course, on Michael Halliday's view. So you have different commodities, goods and services and information, and below in the lexicogramma you have mood type, you have structural choices to realise them. Normally, information, giving of information, is realised by indicative mood choices, declarative and interrogative. And normally, most congruently, commands are realised by imperatives. If you like, the imperative form has, to simplify things, has developed in the language, has evolved in order to give commands. That's what it's there for in the first place. But you can, of course, do things like realise the function of command by an interrogative. In this way you are, as it were, crossing the line of semiotic tension between the semantics and the wording, the lexicogramma, and what you end up with is a new meaning, a polite, what would often be called a polite command. It's a polite request, sorry. It is a kind of command, but it's the fact that it's done, it's performed through the use of a particular structure means that you get something which we have our own term for, a request. And similarly, if a command gets realised in the form of declarative, it can be advice. These aren't always exactly the same, but you get a new kind of way of performing commands. This enables you to create a new meaning. In this case, because it's to do with interpersonal, it's to do with negotiation with your addressee, essentially. Of course, as Michael Halliday pointed out, this is being dealt with in other areas in terms of indirect speech acts. And so, for example, here's one. So it got worse overnight. It's a declarative, but it's clearly interpreted by the addressee, the patient, as a question for confirmation. Yeah. Now, Lvov talks about this in terms of A and B events. A events are things that I know about as the speaker. B events are things that you, the other person, know about. So here he says, if A, the doctor, makes a statement about a B event, the patient, it is heard as a request for confirmation. This was a powerful insight but I think with SFL we can actually formulate it rather more accurately. If A utters a declarative clause about a B event, it is heard as a question. So the distinction in SFL between the form and the function allows us to give a more precise characterization. And it's not just a question, it's a particular type of question, a request for clarification. Both things, both sides, you have a declarative as if a statement about a B event. Remember, a statement is giving information. So I'm giving you, that I'm the doctor giving you information about yourself, but of course it's heard as a question. Why does this work like this? Precisely because it isn't an interrogative question, but a declarative question. Both sides contribute to the meaning made, which is why, for example, in the data that I have, doctors will use this form, patients very rarely do. When patients want to ask a question, they typically ask interrogative questions. Doctors will ask, because of course in a sense it says, I know this, but I need you to confirm it. And that reflects the doctor's social role. So one is nested inside the other. Now, for the patient, they respond in the correct way. The doctor uses this, amongst other things, quite unconsciously to project their position of authority, but of concern for the other person, without, as it were, showing, I don't know. So you can see how the people involved can make perfectly good communicative use. It's just the analyst who has to worry about, how do I record both, how do I explain this? It's worth noting, by the way, that in a sense this is the interpersonal equivalent of nominalization, in that it happens within the interpersonal metafunction. So it's an intra-metafunctional kind of metaphor. But, at this point I need to do a little. One has to say that not everybody in SFL agrees. I gave a similar talk in China, and at the end Ruqayya Hassan stood up and said she disagreed with everything I'd said. So there is a disagreement. I just mentioned some of the points that have been raised against this view. But basically, a number of people within SFL, and this of course doesn't help the analyst either, because we have disagreement, very polite disagreement on the whole amongst ourselves. Is it necessary to call on the idea of metaphor, particularly interpersonal? These are the unmarked wordings for speech acts in particular contexts. This is just how we do requests. So why do we need an idea of metaphor? Choices in how we, for example, realise commands can be included in the normal move network. We just need a more delicate network. And there is no double take. This is a term I've taken from Robin Fawcett, who says basically metaphor involves the idea of double take. You do a sort of, oh, that's what it means. Now, perhaps unnecessary to say, I don't agree with this. Otherwise I wouldn't be giving this talk. So I rebut. First of all, I think the comparison with lexical metaphor is useful. Lexical metaphor, the traditional kind of metaphor, lexical metaphors die, they become dead metaphors, when the original meaning fades. In other words, when there is no sense of tension. And if you take, for example, one I quite like, crippling. To cripple means to stop someone from being able to walk properly. That's its original meaning. If you look at the 11,700,000 hits on Google, I didn't look at all of them, apparently. I looked at the sample. The kinds of things you find are...
Well, if you go to World of Warcraft, you actually get crippling supplex. And I think that is a literal meaning of stopping someone from being able to walk. in gaming. It's interesting that in a very futuristic thing like gaming, online gaming, online games, you've actually got this original meaning hanging on. But far more of the kind of examples are crippling pain, crippling self-doubt, crippling debt. So you could argue crippling pain, well, I suppose that could actually stop you from walking well. Crippling self-doubt, I don't know that anybody self-doubting necessarily walks around like that, though they may. Crippling debt, no, clearly not. And one I found which I rather liked, 11 things you must do to avoid crippling your child. So I thought, what, not break his legs? Not give him bad shoes? No, it clearly, this person has no sense of crippling in its original meaning. And if you go to things like the phraseology, a crippling burden, then the original meaning is almost completely lost. So when a lexical metaphor, the original link, gets lost, it starts dying. On the other hand, interrogatives realising questions don't fade away. It's not that, oh, I've stopped using interrogatives for questions because I only use them for polite requests now. No, the question function of interrogatives is still its dominant one. There is a possible exception with shui and shlai, but that's part of that. Should we have a coffee? Shall I do it for you? But that's because certainly in my idiolect, and I think quite often for many people, shall is almost disappearing. So it's not just, it's kind of on the borderline between grammar and lexical choice, that the shall bit of grammar, so grammar does sometimes lose, fade, but that's a small area. Typically at the larger level, interrogatives still very often get used. You can't ignore the fact that they are used for questions. And if, as analysts, explaining the motivation for conventionalised uses, like interrogative used for command, like question, requires reference to the original uses. I would say you cannot understand why it is that an interrogative being used for a command gets a meaning of polite request unless you go back and look at the fact that what do interrogatives normally do and how does that fit together with what I'm trying to, the speech function. And so, contra Robin Fawcett, I don't think it's a question of double take but of double reading, of stratal tension. That is the key factor for me, the key criterion for recognising grammatical metaphor. The tension between what a structure typically does, congruently does, and what's happening here, and how the new meaning arises from the combination of both. However, this actually isn't this kind of metaphor is not the main one that I'm interested in, the main one that causes problems. I'll explain why in a moment. Because I want to go back to representing interpersonal metaphor. There's that well-known kind of example. I think it isn't uploaded yet, is it? And if we think of the key features of a structure like that, then it's prototypically subject is I or we, or you, typically in interrogatives. It's typically present tense or modalised, only typically, doesn't have to be. Mental cognition process. It projects a clause which is the clause that's being modally assessed. So I'm telling you it isn't uploaded and modally assessing that as I present it to you. The tag very often picks up on the projected clause. This won't always be true, but in cases like this it is. You could argue that the projecting clause can be omitted without affecting the ideational content. If I leave it out, I'm still telling you, or still asking, it isn't uploaded yet, is it? Polarity transfer is possible. So rather than I think it isn't, you can say I don't think it is. There are slight differences in meaning, but they are essentially the polarity is moving around, attracted in that case to the other interpersonal bit of the clause, because polarity is an interpersonal meaning. That reminds me, or that made me then think of, and this is following up from something that comes in, I think, in the 3rd edition of IFG and is developed, the fact that it's not just modal, we can also get this overlap with speech function, where instead of labelling your modality, you label the speech function as you perform the speech function. So I'd say it's not a fair deal, is it? If we look at that, prototypically the subject is I, or we, or sometimes you. Present tense or modalised. A verbal process, I'd say. Projecting a projected clause in which the act which is labelled in the first clause is performed. So by saying it's not a fair deal, you are saying it's not a fair deal, and you're telling the person that I'm saying it. There are reasons, of course, why you would label your discourse act, why you don't just say it's not a fair deal, rather than I'd say it's not a fair deal, but that is precisely because that allows you to do something extra, to make more meaning. The tag, in this case, this is a real example, picks up on the projected clause. I'd say it's not a fair deal, is it? The projecting clause can be omitted without affecting the ideational content. It's not a fair deal, is it? And in some cases, less in this case than in others, the polarity transfer is possible. So I wouldn't say it's a fair deal, is it? It's very similar in meaning to I'd say it's not a fair deal. So we've got these two areas. One difference there is that instead of a mental process, we have a verbal process. So here's just a few examples, real examples. I swear I'm not making this up. So labelling what you're doing. Very often with these, you can actually put in the hereby. I hereby swear. Won't with all everything, but that can be a little sign. This is what's going on. I'm labelling my discourse as I produce it. I must admit I get tired when I work out heavy. We would like to emphasise that. And in fact, they go on to emphasise it. They tell you, I want to make this emphatic. I'm wondering whether functioning as a question, and notice the person put a question mark at the end, even though this is a declarative. So they clearly have a sense of they're doing two things at once, even though they wouldn't be able to talk about it in those terms. And first, could I ask you whether you use the internet? So negotiating the right to ask the question which I want to ask you. I don't want you to answer whether I've got the right, I want you to answer my question. Labouring proposals. I'd suggest that you look at this. In other words, do it. But by saying I'd suggest, you can bring in a softening, becomes a kind of advice. At least if you're trying to look intelligent by degrading me, then could I advise you to at least come up with some new insults? This wasn't taken from the recent sizzling discussions, but it could have been. Could I advise you to? And of course, the well-known thing of the objective modal metaphor, as Halliday called it. It is possible that where the proposition that I want to modalise is actually an embedded clause, functioning as carrier of the, apparently, of the attribute possible. So I'm saying that this proposition, this fact, tumour infiltrating granulocytes promote tumour progression, is described as possible. So I'm using the resources of carrier attribute in order actually to, in a sense, disguise the fact that this is my opinion. It can sometimes be a post-modifier. There is some likelihood that your credit card number is for sale in the dark corner of the internet.
However, it is suggested here, again, discourse. Not so frequently, discourse labels aren't so frequently used for this, they're used for other things, but you can get it. And on this basis, we put forward the argument that. So you've got both structures used for both modalising and speech act labelling. So this is basically experientialising the interpersonal. Halliday and Matheson talk about this as upgrading interpersonal assessment from group to clause rank. That's clearly right. I think we can also see it as concretising the assessment, converting interpersonal field meaning to compatible particulate meaning, wording, while still keeping the field meaning, so having the combination. This allows more gradation. If you have clauses, you can do more in a clause than you can in groups. So it seems highly likely, if not absolutely certain, that, and so you can kind of carry on modalising and adding degrees of modalisation. Similarly, you can do the same with negotiating speech acts. Do you think I could perhaps ask you to enlighten me? In other words, enlighten me, but negotiating before you do that. And of course, because you've experientialised it, you can actually go back to, as it were, the wording. My mother-in-law, who died now, but she used to say things like, "I think it's really terrible, don't I, Frank?" So her tags would pick up on the "I thinking." And my wife and I would look at each other, and she was a wonderful woman, no sort of classical education, but she'd look at us and she'd say, "I'm being discoursely deviant again, aren't I?" She'd heard that phrase. "Yes, you are, Rose." If I'm paying for a ticket, that should include the price of toilet paper, I would think. One passenger told the BBC. Yes, you would think. So the writer is able to pick up on the experientialisation and treat it as if it was not primarily a modal expression, but actually a statement of mental process, because it is both at the same time. Can I ask you to review my site? You can, but I make no promises. So rather than talking about doing it, the answer responds to the experientialisation of the discourse label. I wonder what would have happened if Glazier or someone like him was going through Juventus. This is something to do with football, I have no idea. You can wonder as much as you like. You can also wonder if Osama might be hidden in Blasi's locker. So again, it's possible to, as it were, jump over the function and focus on the wording and respond to that. So in summary, I think we can see interpersonal metaphor as we can enact the intra-metafunctional options, the indirect speech acts, or we can represent, and the representing interpersonal co-opting ideational meanings in order to create new interpersonal meanings. And this may be this modality, it's also mood speech function, and I'm not having time to look at it now, but I think it also works for appraisal. So that's a sort of summary of the map I'm working with. But for the analyst, and this is where I get on to the despairing bits, or not quite despairing, but the more depressing bits, it raises practical problems, particularly for quantitative-based corpus studies. We all want to make more important. What do we count? Do we count where a thing is or how fast it's going? Particle meaning, ideational meaning, or field meaning, interpersonal, wording or meaning. Now, if we look first at the Speech Act, the discourse labelling, the enacting kind, this I think is generally not such a problem. So here's a quick extract. It's from one of those things on television. I'm sure you have them. This is Tricia, where people come on television in order to have their moment of glory, their 15 minutes of glory, and talk about their problems. Displaying problems that normally should be kept private to the public. And here, it's not a terribly bad problem. Sally has got a problem with she's working and her partner isn't, and she's upset about this, and she wants to go on live television and tell everybody about it. And people in the audience give advice and react. I'm sure you do have this in Tunisia. Horrible. Anyway, but great data. Let me ask you, Sally, the T is Tricia, the hostess. Let me ask you, Sally, if the fact that he went means that he failed your test. Yes, he did. I can't remember where he went, but yes. Yes, sorry, it's to a member of the audience. Audience member. I feel that Sally's actually setting them up a bit. Because the thing that seems to me is that Sally's going out to work, he's unemployed, and she feels he's frittering away his time at home when he should be out there earning money the same as she is. Is that it? He says, but Sally doesn't get a word in anyway, because the audience still goes on. I feel that she's pushing him away. Thank you. But is that how you feel, Sally? I feel as if I'm the sole earner. Well, it should be equal. And I'm working all day, and he's free to do anything. What about these mood swings, throwing things and all that sort of thing? It gets me so annoyed, he doesn't understand where I'm coming from. Can I ask why, Sally? I don't trust him. Now, we can separate that and look at it in terms of speech functions going on. And basically, most of this is actually congruent. So we have an interrogative question, we have declarative statements, the pairings. There are two examples. Down the bottom, we have an interrogative question. Can I ask why, Sally? So something's going on there, but it's still within, it's still a question, and it's still expressed by an interrogative. The first one, however, let me ask you, Sally, is actually an imperative, but it's functioning as a question. But that's not too many, and I found on the whole, apart from certain kinds of data, typically spoken, this kind of metaphor is quite characteristic of face-to-face interaction rather than written, for example. On the whole, it's not too difficult to record and recognise both of these going on. Obviously, if you're looking then at speech acts, at indirect speech acts, then you typically take very small sections where something happens like this. But if you look at long bits of data, in my experience, it's not too much of a problem. It's there, but when we come to quantifying each person, representing, I want to look fairly quickly at 3 case studies illustrating the kind of problems that I've been having. First, I'm not going to go into great detail here, but I'm trying desperately to finish writing a study of conjunction as a broad category between propositions, between clauses, and one of the things I'm looking at is intra-complex, so within the sentence, if you like, the proportions of projection and expansion. Okay? In 6 different registers, sample of 6 different registers, and the all at the end is the total. The differences are actually of expansion and projection. So I thought, right, I can compare this. It's going to be nice. Hopefully, it's going to be nice and easy, and it will show that we're getting roughly similar results. Doesn't have to be the same, but also the nice thing is, if they are, then I can add them all together and get a total, which means that there's a much bigger sample, so we're getting more of a sense of what's going on in the language as a whole. Now, as it happens, Christian and I came up quite independently with pretty exactly the same proportion, 79%, 21%. I didn't look at this until after I'd done mine, and Kristen, of course, hadn't seen mine. So, but Nesbitt and Plum came up with something that is statistically different. It doesn't look much, but it's actually statistically different. 84-16, fewer cases of projection. I went to their data. They don't give too much of it, but you could find. And of course, simply all that's happened is Christian and I include interpersonal projection. They don't. So the figures can't be compared. Christian actually says, while such cases are expressions of modal assessment, they're at the same time very clearly projections of ideas. So we're in line, but Nesbitt and Plum aren't. It's not that they're wrong, they're doing something different. Now, it happens that with my data, I could take out my projections because I've labelled them as interpersonal projection. Christian's data doesn't allow me to do that the way it's presented, and similarly with Nesbitt and Plum, I don't know how many cases they've cut out. So is this because they're using different data? It could even be that if they included it, the figures would be different. I just don't know. So I'm not able very securely to say this is what's happening, simply because we're reporting slightly different things. If I move on to another one, theme of variation, this was a study I did with Margaret Berry and Hilary Hillier, where we were looking at theme. Various ways. Looking at written and spoken text produced by the same two people, looking at how thematic choices construe or do not construe features of the context. One of the examples we looked at is fairly simple. This is from a telephone conversation. I gather you're having a bit of a tiring time. Even there are various ways of analysing theme. We've got this I gather, which I would count as an interpersonal projection. So, do we just say the theme is I? Don't worry about the second one, let's just show you the answer. Interestingly shown that this is recognised as H asking a question, which is responded to, but I is that the theme? Do we go clause by clause, I and you, or do we just say, well, there's one theme there with an interpersonal element, I gather, and the theme is you? Not too bad, though it can add up. But then we have this from a written text by one of the people involved. Further, it's important to note that although the discussion is concerned principally with exploring how hearers interpret the meaning of sentences, utterances at the semantic level, it does appear to extend the scope of the overall theory, or of theories, to try to account for a hearer's inference or speaker's intention at the level of, say, indirect request. Which is about the kind of thing I'm talking about, but that's an accident. How do we analyse that? Well, we've got potentially, I think, two interpersonal frames. It is important. Modulation, we should. To note that, and I was actually able to ask the writer of this, and she meant note in the sense of tell you rather than you note it. So she is noting it as she tells us this. So it's a discourse label. So what do we do about theme? Well, I'm not going to go into great detail, but basically, because to note that is all an embedded clause, and therefore, as it were, technically downgraded informationally, we can go with what I think Halliday's IFG would say, which is it further is textual, it is the theme. Not telling us very much what's going on. Perhaps then let's say, well, ignore the fact that this is really embedded, so let's have a clause by clause, although the discussion, and then later on down below it does this thing. Or let's take it is important to note that as interpersonal metaphor, interpersonal element in theme, so let's go on at the T unit level to although the discussion, but then we still need it. Let's do the T unit one. where the whole of the initial subordinate clause, dependent clause is seen as theme. So the theme is from further down to level. But then, of course, just to complicate matters, there's a whole group of people working with SFL who argue that you must always have subject theme, so we need to include it. So with that sentence, there are 5 different ways of analysing theme. If I'm counting theme, which do I count? Well, the answer, I don't know. Margaret and I actually ended up doing different analyses. One of the things we were actually looking for is interpersonal themes, and just counting them. Margaret ended up, who is a wording person, ended up with 21 interpersonal themes. In the same data, I ended up with 43. You know, which one is, well, neither is right. Margaret actually believes that her way is better. I believe that my way is kind of better, but I can see the value. I think they're doing 2 different things. But you know, which figure do we report? In fact, in this case, we were lucky. We were actually, part of our theme of our paper was differences in how we analyse themes. So we were able to record them and say, look, this is why we're doing them differently. But you don't always have that luxury. And a final example now from, one thing I will just mention, Mick O'Donnell's UAN corpus tool, which is wonderful. He's now built in automatic analysis, and he has had to make this decision. So if you automatically do theme analysis, you end up with what I would call the minimal theme. So if we go back to that one, I feel that Sally's actually setting them up a bit. The theme is I, not I feel that Sally. It could be an alternative one. That's not a criticism, really. It is simply, if you're doing something like this, you have to make a decision, particularly if you're trying to do it automatically. It has a very serious knock-on effect. So the final quick example, transitivity. I'm looking at various kinds of transitivity choices in various registers. I won't read all of this, you do have it, but if we divide it into interpersonal projection and other, then we've got it is possible that, there is evidence that, it has been suggested that, it is well known that, there is some evidence that. I would argue all of these are interpersonal, objective modality metaphors. If we do a transitivity analysis, I've done the analysis of the projecting clauses and I've underlined the others. One gives us this kind of. So what we might call, if I just go with all the processes, then there are 16 in this sort of text pack. 11 of those are what might be called true experiential. 5 of them are interpersonal stroke experiential, so they're in the interpersonal projection. What do I count? Do I report those, or somehow try to report both? And just finishing, here going back to the Sally, which I said was not a problem in terms of enacting. If we do it in terms of transitivity, problems do arise. Let me ask you, Sally, I feel that, because the thing that seems to me is that, I feel as if, can I ask? So these are all interpersonal negotiation. Again, if we do the transitivity analysis, and again, if we go to the totals, not quite such a high proportion, but still, of 32 processes, 7 of those are in this negotiation area. So what do I report? Just true experiential, all of them, or trying to do both. So, what do we do about this? And I don't have the answers, but I have 2 recommendations. First of all, be transparent. Tell us what you are doing, which of course people typically do. They spell out exactly what kind of analysis they're doing, but if possible, report your findings in a way Bear in mind that there will be other people who may want to be looking at it slightly differently. If there's a possibility, report your findings in a way which allows them to work with your findings. Because in SFL, it is crucial that we carry on pooling our analyses to get bigger and bigger samples of being able to talk about this is what's happening in transitivity across a wide range of texts. I can't do it all myself, but I can draw on other people, Nesbitt and Plum, Christian Matheson, and so on. And learn how to cultivate double vision. Do you see the girl or the flower? Both, yes. How do you see them? How do you train yourself to see them? And how do you train yourself to tell other analysts how to see them? So, no answers, but a few recommendations. Thank you.
I think that perhaps it is possible that some of you have some questions. Is there anyone who would like to dive in with a remark, comment, question? Nick?
Hi, thanks, Jeff. Very good talk. Very happy to hear. I'm quite surprised you and Christian have such a high degree of correlation because in my corpus work I find that unless you have very similar corpora, matched corpora in comparable corpus in this way, the proportions are going to be very different. The degree of use of any linguistic resource will vary if you're in casual conversation, if you're in an opinion essay or an argumentative essay. Things just vary a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit, I was really quite surprised. And I wasn't sure whether I was pleased or worried because Christian's is, I think you called it an archive, don't you? It is. But it's fairly registerially varied. Mine was consciously registerially varied, and there were quite narrowly defined text types. As you saw, the proportion was all around the average line in my data. I can't remember whether Christian reports details of the different types of text. But yeah, I was surprised, and in a sense, Nesbitt and Plums was more what I expected to see. But I did a very rough calculation, very rough, and actually it ended up, if I somehow adjusted their data, doing a small sample and extrapolating, adding in, it again came out pretty close. So that 80-20 looks like something about possibly the language as a whole.
Okay.
With variation from text type to text type, which does become, if you get enough data, it becomes statistically significant. Yeah.
Can I say more?
Yes, I was actually going to ask something very similar to me, which was about the registered composition. Thank you. Because this is on. Yes. Because taking advice from the introduction, because Nesbitt and Plum, of course, they use the woof text, right? The interviews with dog breeders.
Yeah.
So registerially very narrow. But as now we learned from your answer to me that we both try to work with registerially mixed text. It would be interesting to return. I mean, I've done a lot more counts since that, but I have the impression, precisely what you say, is that when you look at particular registers, you get a lot of variation. So compare news reporting with, say, something that is much more instructional text. Instructional text, virtually no projection. News reporting, it's very central feature because of the need to attribute and so on. But I have the same sense as you when you begin to average across the register samples, and it sort of evens out this way. I also feel what you said about data sharing and analysis sharing is very important. And I think something like mixed schools could help us do this if we use them systematically. But thank you very much.
Just one last comment, incidentally. I wasn't looking at projection across clause complexes. If you do include that, then things like narrative projection shoots up because you have lots of projected clauses without projecting clauses. You just have quotes, which I'm coding as projected clauses. So actually, then the numbers do shoot up registerially defined. But looking just within the clause, you do tend to get this surprisingly, less variation than I would have predicted.
Thank you. I think that thank you. The unease stems from the incongruity of trying to use a formal grammatical toolkit to deal with a question that should be dealt with in pragmatics. In other words, when you were giving these examples, I was thinking of the rhetorical figure of analogy. Of Goffman's theatricality and make-believe, of the face work literature in pragmatics. How do you manage to square incompatible frameworks?
Basically by saying there is only one framework. I mean, of course, one way you can handle this is precisely what you're divide and conquer. SFL likes to get it all in there and then worry about the problems, rather than say, I'm going to leave that to someone else to look at. So it is a theoretical stance. I agree with you, that is one way. We still got the division, this semiotic tension, but we try to want to say, in order to understand what the grammar is doing here, we cannot just say, I'll leave what's happening in terms of pragmatics to someone else, or I'll do that next week. It is all part of our lexicogrammatical, semantic, semiotic analysis. So we want to keep it all in there in order to make a better understanding of what's going on.
We started getting into the coffee break time, so perhaps you could...
Just a question from the
Well, okay,
yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm not in linguistics, but actually literature, but
never mind.
I enjoy the presentation because I have discovered the possibility of a contact zone between SFL and the literary text, which is seen particularly in relation to metaphor. And if I start from the picture here, I have a line from the poem, your face is a garden full of roses and lilies. So it actually fits the picture. And I'm wondering about the possibility of investing in this possible rapprochement between SFL and the literary text. So I'm just trying to see or try to understand other possibilities of applying SFL to the literary text. Of course, you're not going to answer me now, but maybe later on we'll have a chat about this possibility that we could apply, for example, in the analysis of literary text. And thank you so much.
Yes, Goatley has done work on this. Has done some very interesting work. I tend to try to avoid literature because it scares me. Things are going on there, and I don't feel.
I saw actually the monster in the picture earlier.
When I do narrative, I go that my narrative sample is from romantic fiction, which I would not classify as literature, but it's a lot easier for an analyst like me.